So many problems in teamwork boil down to assumptions we make about other people are thinking the same way we are. And that so much of the guidance that is about having better teamwork and better leadership is about making those tacit assumptions explicit. So we can make sure we're on the same page, we can verify them, we can negotiate any differences in perspective. Once we've both said, here's what I think we're doing, here's how I think we should do it. Now at least we can have a discussion about it.
Welcome to Leadership, the podcast where leadership meets real-world insights. In each episode, you can eavesdrop on exclusive conversations with top thought leaders, best-selling authors, and experts in leadership, communication, relationships, culture, and everything else that shapes your effectiveness in the workplace and in your personal life. Leadership is here for you. Now, here's our host, himself a seasoned coach and best-selling author, Dr. Roger Dean Duncan.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Leadership, where we explore the minds behind transformative ideas in leadership, resilience, teamwork, relationships, and everything related to human performance. Our guest for this episode is Dr. Colin M. Fisher, professor at University College in London and author of The Collective Edge: Unlocking the Secret Power of Groups. In a world that often glorifies solo genius, Dr. Fisher makes a compelling case for the underestimated and underappreciated power of group dynamics, especially when teams are diverse, messy, and brilliantly unpredictable. Drawing on years of research into decision-making, collaboration, and improvisation, Dr. Fisher reveals how the best leaders don't just manage teams, they unlock them. Whether you're leading a startup, a nonprofit, or a global enterprise, this conversation will challenge how you think about influence, inclusion, and the art of knowing when to speak and when to listen. Dr. Colin Fisher, welcome to Leadership.
Thanks so much for having me, Roger. I'm excited to be here.
Well, thank you. Now, in the context of team performance, how do you define collective edge?
The collective edge is really about what we can do together that we could never do on our own. And that edge is the ability to not just, get together in groups and collaborate, but to have those groups actually be effective. And that for what I've seen in my work with leaders and organizations is that too often we sort of overlook groups entirely, and that our focus is on managing individuals, managing our own performance. And so what I hope the collective edge is a set of principles that allows you to have your collectives be more effective.
Well, what do you see as the biggest myth about group decision-making?
Boy, there are so many to choose from there. That I think one of the myths that I often find myself fighting is about the role of advocacy in group decision-making. And that, a lot of people have kind of heard the conventional wisdom, if we want to have better decisions, we should have a devil's advocate in our group. But actually, research shows that advocacy is often the enemy of effective group decisions. And that's especially true at the beginning of discussions and when it's leaders who are doing the advocating. Now, if we think about group decisions as an opportunity for us to find information that we don't all know about, and then kind of collectively analyze that information, like it's us against the problem, that's
Right.
when we're going to actually have good group decisions. But when we get into this mode of advocacy and we think, I'm trying to get my way and I'm trying to argue against you getting your way and bring you over to my side, that's where groups tend to make mistakes. And they tend to get into some of these dysfunctional patterns that, unfortunately, we know all too well from experience.
Well, and unfortunately, I would say that we have a lot of modeling for bad behavior on television where we have gladiators with microphones. they don't really try to understand each other or solve a problem. They just want to make their point and overpower someone. So maybe that's the modeling that's causing some problems.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think these problems certainly predate the modern political environment. And
Sure.
I think they are, they're sort of natural psychological tendencies in some ways. They've just sort of started to rage out of control with the modern attention economy, where, a lot of people's goals isn't, just to actually persuade people. It's simply to get more attention.
Right.
And that, doing these kinds of things is effective at attracting attention, but it's not so effective at actually solving problems collectively.
Right. So why do so many teams fail to capitalize on their full potential?
And I mean, there's so many reasons that teams fail to capitalize on their full potential. The most important one is that we overlook a lot of the simple things that make collaboration possible. And that a lot of those things are what I call structure. And the structure is like the bones of the group. And they're things like the goals and the purpose that we collectively understand, the tasks that we are doing in the group, and these kind of hidden, invisible social norms about how we interact. And what happens for the most part is when we get into groups, we get very focused on the task. We get focused on how other people perceive us. We get focused on persuading others to, do what would be in our interests and what we want. And then we don't pay attention to these kind of structural bones of the group, and they kind of get neglected and ignored, and that we assume everybody's on the same page when they're not. And so groups often, especially at work, are kind of set up for failure from the start, where we're not thinking about what, the group needs to get its work done. And instead, we're thinking about a whole bunch of other things that are more at the individual or organizational level.
What role do personality types play in group success or failure?
Yeah, it's funny. I get this question a lot, and the answer is actually not that much. And that personality types, when we think about personality types that people tend to know about in from their daily lives, they're often stuff that doesn't have a lot of scientific basis. And there are, a lot of tools that are sold by very reputable companies purporting to say, oh, we're going to, do this assessment, and we're going to tell you, how we should assign people onto your team. For the most part, there's not much research basis for that. And there's not even much research basis for, what social psychologists call the big five personality types. This kind of ocean model of openness to experience, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism, and I skipped one in there somewhere. But there's not much evidence that these big five personality types actually can be used to assign people to teams and predict team performance. So we can't say, oh, let's have, 3 extroverts and therefore we need to have 2 introverts on this team. That there's not really any science behind that.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And in fact, there's really only one trait that researchers have found predicts collective performance. And this is research on collective intelligence, where they measured everything they could think of, everything that we can sort of reliably measure. And that includes individual intelligence. And surprisingly, even the average level or the maximum level of individual intelligence doesn't predict team performance across a variety of tasks. The only thing that did predict was what we call social sensitivity. And social sensitivity is the ability to read others' emotions without being told what they are. And that it's kind of a fun test that they use to assess this, called reading the mind in the eyes, where they take these cutouts of people's eyes and that you have 4 options for how the person was feeling when that photo was taken. So that social sensitivity does seem to give teams an advantage when you have a high average level of social sensitivity on your team. So that is probably the only trait that I can say there's good science behind assessing in order to compose your teams.
So if I'm pulling together a team, how can I know the level of social sensitivity of the individual players if I'm putting together a team?
So you probably won't. I mean, you could, I think it's something that sometimes we kind of can intuit about people.
Right.
But I would also say, just because science has found that this is predictive, that doesn't mean it's the most important factor. So just because there's, it's the only personality trait that works, this still isn't explaining that much about team performance in the grand scheme of things. Most of team performance on the composition side is explained by two other factors. And the first one is, do we have the necessary knowledge, skills, and abilities on the team? And that is something in an organization you can probably assess. And it's shocking how many times that organizations don't even do that assessment.
Right.
They don't put the right knowledge and skills on the team. And that we also, we want to have a mix of those knowledge and skills. That just like we don't want to have a band with all drummers, or we don't want to have a basketball team with all point guards, we want people who can complement one another, not so much in personality, but in what they know, how they think, and what they can do. And so that should be your first port of call, is say, what kinds of knowledge, skills, abilities are we going to need for this task? Who's got those? Do we have them, and do we have a good mix of them? Then the second thing that you should be paying attention to, and this is the one I would say that people at work mess up the most, is the size of your team.
Right.
And that most teams in organizations are too big.
Right. You don't want a crowd.
No, you don't want a crowd, but I promise you, if you go into most senior leadership team meetings in organizations and 100% of boards of directors, you're going to find a crowd, not an optimally sized team.
Right.
And so research suggests that the right size for a team, and I'm trying to get everybody to call this Hackman's number after my mentor, Richard Hackman, who did research into the point at which we think teams are neither too big nor too small. And that he found that the lines for when we think teams are too big and when we think they're too small, it crosses right at 4.5 members. So that's a pretty good proxy for about the number of people you want on the team.
Yeah.
Anywhere from 3 to 7 can work. But if you have 10, 12, 15 people on your team and you're trying to get everybody into a room trying to do work at the same time, that's probably where you're failing in terms of assembling your team, rather than did I correctly assess the social sensitivity of everyone there. So it's only after you get these two things right should you then worry at all about the social sensitivity of members.
Well, of course, some organizations are challenged because they want to make sure that every possible group is represented. We want to make sure we have a blue-eyed, left-handed Volvo driver. And I think that challenges some work in putting together teams. Now, what happens when a group has no clear leader?
I'm not that worried if a group doesn't have a formal leader, because groups don't necessarily need formal leaders, but they do need leadership. And so that means we do need people who are going to take responsibility for the goals, purpose of the group, of monitoring our performance, of making sure that we have connections to the outside world and can get the resources we need. So these things need to get done, but they don't have to be consolidated in a single person with a formal role. So it's more work if we don't have that formal leader to say, all right, here's the key leadership functions that need to be accomplished. Who's going to do them? They don't need to all be the same person. They don't all need to be one person, but they need to get done. And there's actually a lot of research that shows that groups that share leadership do tend to perform better on average than groups that try and consolidate leadership in a single individual and organize themselves more hierarchically. So in a way, I might be less worried about a group without a formal leader than one with a formal leader. But that means these groups are going to need to communicate more. and they're going to need to be aware of how they're getting their leadership needs met.
So what role does psychological safety play in unlocking group genius?
Yeah, I mean, psychological safety is so important. And psychological safety is the feeling in the group and the understanding that it's safe to take interpersonal risks. And that means it's safe to speak up and ask a question that maybe you're worried is going to be a dumb question. It's safe to make a suggestion that challenges the status quo and maybe some other people aren't going to like. And it's safe to kind of discuss almost anything that we need to discuss that's relevant for the task. And safe doesn't mean comfortable and like a warm bath and harmonious.
Right.
It means that, like, I'm confident I'm not going to get ostracized even when we need to have a difficult conversation. That you're not going to smack me down for speaking up and bringing up a difficult subject.
Well, I've noticed in a lot of organizations where I've done work that the smart leaders are very good about encouraging the newest members of the group to speak up, because they've discovered over time that the newest member can often ask what somebody might call a naive question, like, why do we do it this way? And then that challenges the status quo that in a way that some people might not have thought of doing. So that's certainly one way to make us an environment psychologically safe.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think there's two things that I think are great about that. One is just the leaders using asking questions and asking for contributions to get people talking in the group. But two, newcomers are this fantastic source of new ideas, and they are great ways of challenging the status quo. So I think really when you have a newcomer in your group, that's this great opportunity for change that you don't have that often. And taking advantage of that really purposefully is very, very smart. But I think too, to take this attitude when you are that newcomer, that's also your opportunity to enact positive change in a group by asking those questions. And so not to feel like, oh, I'm asking all these naive questions and I'm doing the group harm. You're actually probably doing everyone a favor by asking about, why do we do it this way? I'm not really sure what we're doing here. What is it we're supposed to accomplish? Those are often the questions that others have just gotten used to not asking. And therefore, we end up with a group that keeps doing the same thing over and over and over.
So how do leaders unintentionally suppress valuable dissent? What are some of the things they do that they might not be aware of?
So, I mean, if you aren't hearing much dissent, you're probably doing something that's suppressing it.
Right.
And so, when I hear it's like, oh, we always get along, we always seem to agree really quickly right away, we don't need these fancy decision processes, that's probably a sign that you are not encouraging people to speak up when they disagree with you. So, first you can diagnose this by just the amount of dissent that you're hearing. But then what are you doing? Well, if you're trying to rush people along, or even very subtly making it clear that you don't think their contribution is valuable, that they're slowing us down, that that's a dumb question or a dumb idea, those things are likely to reduce the likelihood that people speak up in the future. And that we know from decades of social psychology that bad is stronger than good in our brains. And that, when a leader especially gives negative feedback to somebody, they remember that 4 times as much as they would remember the equivalent positive feedback. And so, you can think, oh, I'm praising people a lot, but you have to do a lot of encouraging people to speak back up just for one time that you snapped at somebody and made them feel small or feel not valued in the team.
Yeah.
Now, this is a tricky balance to strike, right? Because if we all share every little tidbit and scrap of thought that we have in every meeting, that would take forever. And so you do have to have people where you can trust everyone to kind of self-regulate, and that this comes back to this idea of sharing leadership, to say, all right, we've got an hour for this discussion. We want to hear from everybody. We want to make sure that everybody shares the most important things they're thinking about and challenges us when it seems like we might be making a mistake. But this is how much time we've got to make this particular decision. So everybody keep an eye on that and try and regulate your contributions accordingly.
Well, that certainly is a great way to kind of establish the ground rules. How do you coach leaders to intervene without dominating?
I mean, if you are intervening, your job number one is not to disempower your employees by your intervention. I've done a lot of research on leaders who are helping in more intense ways, in what we call deep help, where they actually dive in with their teams, and they're there for hours or sometimes days. And the challenge in those situations, when you're doing these more involved interventions, is to make sure that your employees don't feel like you're taking ownership of their work away from them. They need to feel like you're not doing this because you don't trust them, because you think they're not doing a good job. And so the leaders that I've studied take a lot of care to make sure that when they're going to really try and help someone intensely, that's what they're doing. They're coming in and saying, I'm just here to help. This is still your job. These are your calls. But I want to be here to support you with what you need. They're asking a lot of questions, and they're listening really carefully to the answer, and they're hearing what it is that their employees feel like they need, and that they're trying to, if they need to gently nudge them about what it is that they need, that you can do that gradually. But if you come in hot and you say, here's what I think you need, and that's not what the person thinks they need, that's where you're going to get into problems. And so, to be helpful, you have to know what that person thinks of the problems that they're facing and what they think they need before you jump in with your suggestions. So I think this idea of asking questions, listening carefully to the answers, and that just being really clear that your purpose here isn't to take over and disempower anyone are some of the main tools I've seen work.
Your change initiative has the budget. The strategy looks solid, and everyone's nodding along in the meetings. But for some reason, it's going nowhere. Dr. Roger Dean Duncan knows why. After 40 years in the trenches with top business leaders, he knows that change fails when organizations lack the right foundations: trust, accountability, and real communication. Dr. Duncan's free 10-minute assessment shows you exactly where your organization stands. Answer a few straightforward questions that reveal your true change readiness level. Don't waste months discovering the hard way. Get your free assessment today at leadershop.net/change. Again, that's leadershop.net/change.
You just answered a question that I was about to ask, and that was, what's the difference between leading from within versus leading from above? And you just answered that.
Yeah. I mean, I think, the best leaders are often jumping in and out of these different roles, that there are some things we have to do where, getting a bunch of people together and saying, hey, what was the purpose of getting together? That's a hard question for the team itself to answer, right? That usually we do need some direction on what we're here to do. And so there's a great quote from General George Patton I'm going to butcher it here, but it's something like, never tell people how to do their jobs. Tell them what to do, and they'll amaze you with their ingenuity. Yeah. And I think that's a good rule of thumb when you're thinking about, like, what do we need to kind of drop down from above? And those things are the purpose and direction of our team or our organization. But how we're going to do that, that's something that you want the team to take accountability for. And that's where your role is to help. It's not to tell them, here's exactly how you do it, but it's to provide support and guidance and resources when they tell you, hey, we're struggling, or we need something, we're trying this, and we need an additional resource, this additional information, maybe even an additional team member. Can you help us get that, leader?
Well, what you just said speaks to the idea of the importance of having a conversation in the team about how the team's going to operate. In other words, have some pretty explicit conversation about the rules of engagement, if you will. That can sometimes be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think everything we're talking about is so many problems in teamwork boil down to assumptions we make about that other people are thinking the same way we are. And that so much of the guidance that is about having better teamwork and better leadership is about making those tacit assumptions explicit. So we can make sure we're on the same page, we can verify them, we can negotiate any differences in perspective once we've both said, here's what I think we're doing, here's how I think we should do it. Now at least we can have a discussion about it.
Sure. So in a team environment, what's the difference between productive friction and toxic conflict?
So disagreement, as we've been saying, disagreement's good. If you never hear people in your team disagree with one another about what the best course of action is, about, how we should do our work, that's not good.
You got the wrong team.
Yeah, that's a sign that there's this kind of dysfunctional pressure to conform or fear to speak up and voice disagreement in your team. So you want to see disagreement about the task. What you don't want to see is this conflict that is about the people, where I'm saying, you're the kind of person who, or I'm saying, something that's personal about you. And that's what we call relationship conflict. And that is pretty much uniformly bad for collaboration and team performance. And so what you're listening for as a leader, and where you need to draw the line, is times where disagreement about the task seems like it's turning personal. And that those should be no-go areas for every team, because it's very hard to put the genie back in the bottle once you have people who don't believe that they have each other's best interests at heart. And that once we have that lack of trust, again, because bad is stronger than good in our brains, it takes a lot of hard work to undo damage that gets done when we start personally attacking each other.
Well, in a team environment, in what ways can disagreement be harnessed as a creative force? In other words, using disagreement as an advantage rather than a disadvantage.
Honestly, I think disagreement's always an advantage. That the reason that I'm saying let's get this mix of different knowledge and skills, let's not have a band where we all play the same instrument or have these same perspectives, is because the only time that we can be more than the sum of our parts is when we have these disagreements. We think different stuff and we try and mix these different things together. And then, there's kind of a model of what philosophers and a lot of people have called dialectics, where you put these two opposing points together, and that as they pull on each other, kind of a third way emerges from these two different perspectives. And that's really what you're trying to have in groups when we see different perspectives add up to something creative. So there's a great example from a company that I did a lot of work with, IDEO, and that there's a famous example where they had worked on designing a jet engine for Boeing, I think it was. And one of the mechanisms within that engine proved to be really useful when they were designing one of the first electric toothbrushes. Now, this is an example of how, being somebody who has these backgrounds in different places and can take ideas from one context to another context is really helpful for creativity. In fact, that's one of the main places creative ideas come from, is taking the same principle from one place to another. And that's really what groups that have these diverse perspectives can do, because those diverse perspectives come from somewhere. They come from experiences that you have outside of this particular team. And that if we invite those in and say, well, here's something that I've seen somewhere else, would that work over here? And somebody else, having a different contrasting perspective, that's where we have these kind of productive disagreements and productive discussions where we can actually get something more creative out of there. And honestly, that's one of the best ways to be creative, is to not see things exactly the same way, but be able to express that and have both of those things exist as potential sources of value for the team.
So what practices seem to help groups stay resilient under pressure?
Being resilient under pressure is, such an important part of being a team. And that part of it is having these basics that we talked about, these bones in place ahead of time. So this is more something that would make you not resilient. So if we don't have the same idea about what we're trying to achieve, if we don't have kind of clear norms of behavior for the best of times and this psychological safety we talked about earlier, the chances that when the pressure's on, we start to fold are quite high. But once we have those in place, the things that we can do additionally are have a great culture of helping one another. And that's because helping is this action that's kind of at the margins of our formal roles in organizations. It's stuff that's kind of falls in between. Often, is that your job? Is that not your job to do? But what help does is that when situations change, we can sort of flexibly deploy the knowledge and effort of different members and say, well, normally this isn't your job, but right now the pressure's on and it's hard for me to do this part of my job. Or there's this new crisis that's out there and I don't know how to handle it. Can other members of the team, are you going to rally to help me? Or are we all going to kind of splinter and get focused on our own jobs? And to me, that's really the essence of resilience, is when the heat is on, does that break these social bonds that hold the team together and that we start splitting apart? Or do we reinforce them by helping one another, supporting one another, and kind of doing things that might not normally be our job? And so those things, I think, are what help teams, really when they are facing these kinds of adversity that they need to be resilient.
Well, some of the most effective teams I've observed have conversations about the sort of thing you just talked about at the very beginning. They talk about, how are we going to handle the situation if this emerges in the group dynamic? They talk about that pretty openly, and then in some cases, they probably just avoid the problems altogether. But if they don't avoid the problem altogether, they at least have some background understanding of how they're going to deal with the problem.
Yeah. I mean, that sounds a lot like a practice I've seen, especially in the military, where you don't just do postmortems of your team projects and sort of say, oh, what went wrong at the end? What could we do better? How can we improve? And you should definitely do that. You should do those things in your team. But pre-mortems are at the very beginning saying, well, what challenges are we likely to face? What could go wrong? What can we do to, make sure that we avoid those things going wrong? Or what are we going to do when some of these challenges do emerge, and how are we going to overcome them? And I think, if you're at the point with your team where you can do these pre-mortems, and that means you've kind of taken care of the basics of getting your team together, then that's a terrific practice. So I think if you can institute the pre-mortems, I highly recommend them.
It reminds me of a conversation I had some time ago with a very smart lady who helps business people form partnerships. And she talked about the importance of having a partnership prenup. In other words, talking very explicitly about how they're going to handle certain situations that could emerge in any partnership. And she says that's very helpful, and I can certainly see how it could be. So what are the early warning signs that a team is losing its edge?
I mean, the early warning signs are people who seem like they're not working in the same direction. And those can be many of the things we think of as a kind of cliches of, bad teamwork and bad groups. So people just don't seem like they're trying as hard as they could be. They're not meeting their commitments. We're not hitting the deadlines. We're not communicating that much, or we're having a lot of misunderstandings, or we're having these kind of moments of conflict and disagreement to the point that they're paralyzing us. But I would say, those teams, they get the most attention in organizations, because obviously when we have kind of open fighting within a team, everybody notices that, and we know that's a big problem. But there's a great study of kind of early Silicon Valley founding teams of these kind of early high-tech organizations, and they looked at the over time, which ones succeeded and which ones failed. And when you look back at the failed ones and their decision-making processes, well, so the first thing I would say about their decision process it was much slower than the teams that were succeeding. But it wasn't slower because they were sharing all this information and getting locked in deliberation. It was slower because they avoided tough issues and they just wouldn't communicate. They wouldn't talk about certain things. And so I think this sign that it's clear people are avoiding issues, they don't want to discuss certain things. Those are kind of the early warning signs where it's like, hey, we're supposed to be here to talk about, a strategic transformation of our organization. We're kind of not talking about that. And we're just talking about ground rules, and we're kind of talking around the elephant in the room all the time.
Right.
And I think that's a much more common problem, where you see a team that's got problems that's not noticing it has problems, and the kind of, decay of that team is going to be much slower over time, where they just kind of keep avoiding, and never quite acknowledge the extent to which they're not doing what they were put together to do.
So as we've talked, I've thought about this question. How can these ideas about group dynamics be applied in classrooms, in families, or communities, or marriages, not just the workplace?
I mean, I think groups are everywhere in our lives, and
Yes.
that these basic principles of how do you set a group up for success, whatever success means, right? What success means in your marriage, hopefully, is quite different than what success means in your work teams. But that these principles of agreeing on the kind of deep underlying purpose of us coming together and collaborating, and saying what we want out of life or what we want out of work are critical foundations on which all teamwork is built. And so I think we can use these same things to just have more effective groups in whatever walk of life that we're concerned with. That there's so many times where I look at the way, projects are put together in school, and that group projects are put together thoughtlessly, where they don't think about, is this a group task? Good group task. They don't think about, is it clear to members what they're supposed to be doing? Do we have the necessary mix of knowledge and skills there to get the work done? And that those things are true, whether we're talking about sometimes is something as simple as a book group or a PTA, as they are in the workplace. So I hope that people can use a lot of these same discussions and these same kind of checklists of, what do I need to check before we get started in the work? What should I do when we're starting out and launching a collaboration? And how should I check as we're going through our work together? And that sometimes, marriages and other kinds of relationships, friendships do involve actual work, and that they're not all just about, romance and the kind of ephemeral parts of relationships, that we need to accomplish things. And that as we sort of look at those things, I would look at those through the same lens that I look at any group about, especially when I'm looking for ways to make it better, something that's good, that's trying to be great, or to look at something that maybe isn't accomplishing its goals as well as it might want to, and how to make it better and right the ship.
As you say this, I'm smiling to myself as I think about so many clients I've worked with over the years where in our first meeting, one of the leaders would say to me, we really are unique. And I would often say, I doubt it. Do you have some of this, some of this, some of this, some of this? I was talking about relationship issues. And he said, yeah, how did you know? I said, well, you have people. These are universal issues. It doesn't matter what kind of business you're in, you're still dealing with people. So all of this about group dynamics is applicable absolutely anywhere, it seems to me.
Yeah, absolutely. What keeps me in business is that groups are a paradox that's a little bit at odds with two fundamental parts of our psychology. One is that we desperately need to belong, that the kind of prehistoric parts of our brain says, if I don't find my tribe, I'm going to die. And that being kicked out of a group and being ostracized, it often was a death sentence in a hunter-gatherer society.
Right. Literally.
And so our brains were designed to be deathly afraid of, being ostracized and not having that sense of belonging. And that's what, breeds the kind of dysfunctional conformity pressure that, we were talking about fighting in a lot of these decision-making groups. But at the same time, we also need this sense of self-determination and the sense of autonomy and being seen and being recognized within these groups. So there's this kind of part of our brain that's saying, hey, blend in, go along to get along, be one of the crowd. And another part of our brain that's saying, no, hey, look at me, I'm really important, and that I want acknowledgement and credit and power and all those things. And that these two things are fighting with each other within each person. And so it's no wonder that they're constantly fighting with each other in all of our groups, in all walks of life. And, the group dynamics aren't a problem to be solved. They're a paradox that we have to constantly manage. And that if you take your eye off the ball for a day, a week, 2 weeks, these problems are going to reemerge because they're baked into the way we experience the social world.
Sure. So what's one question that you wish more leaders would ask themselves?
It comes back to this fundamental question of not how can I help the organization, and not how can I help this person or that person or the other person, but how can I help my group, and how can I make my groups more like real teams that have this sense of interdependence and shared purpose, and the sense of accountability and meaning for a specific task. And I think part of what leaders aren't doing is just looking at the world through the lens of groups. But although groups are the thing that's getting the work done, we spend most of our time managing individual performance, and our organizations are set up for that. So I think just turning your attention and saying, well, what would be different if I thought about my role as leading for groups and leading for team performance rather than leading for individuals?
Well, thank you so much, Colin, for joining us on Leadership. Dr. Fisher reminds us that leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about creating the conditions where the best answers can emerge. The collective edge challenges us to rethink how we show up in groups, how we listen, and how we lead. Because in the end, the most powerful teams are not the ones with perfect harmony. They're the ones with purposeful tension, shared trust, and the courage to be collectively brilliant. If you found this episode valuable, please share it with your team, your network, or anyone else who's ready to lead with more heart and more impact. And be sure to leave a review. Even a single sentence fuels the algorithms that promote the great content that Leadership offers. And for free resources to help you in your leadership journey, go to leadership.net. That's leadership.net. Thanks again for joining us. Until next time, stay safe, be happy, and spread good cheer wherever you go. For Leadership, I'm Roger Dean Duncan.